A second connection between this story and Moses' original audience appears in the motif of the sacrifices offered by Cain and Abel. As Genesis chapter 4 tells us, God rejected Cain's sacrifice but was pleased with Abel's sacrifice. The reason for God's distinctions between these sacrifices is made explicit in Genesis chapter 4 verses 3 and 4, where we read these words. Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, but Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. Notice the way Moses described the sacrifices. In verse 3, he said that Cain offered some of the fruits of the soil. But in verse 4, he wrote that Abel offered fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. This distinction is very important. Cain simply brought whatever fruits of his field he happened to gather. His worship was nominal at best because he did not reserve the best of his crop for God. But Abel fulfilled the law of God with a sincere heart by bringing the fat portions, which were highly prized for Old Testament sacrifices, from among the firstborn of his flocks, which were the most highly prized animals according to the law of Moses. Cain's sacrifice was little more than an insincere ritual, but by contrast, Abel offered sincere devotion to God. Moses also used this distinction between the sacrifices of Cain and Abel to draw further associations with the Egyptians and Israel. This background is striking when we remember that Moses first approached Pharaoh to ask for the release of Israel because he wanted to offer sacrifices to Yahweh. As we read in Exodus chapter 5 verse 3, Moses and Aaron said these words to Pharaoh. The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But Pharaoh refused their request. As Moses recorded in verse 4, Pharaoh told them, Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work. So we see that just as Cain had dishonored God with his nominal sacrifices, the Egyptians did not offer true worship to Israel's God. Yet just as Abel offered sincere and acceptable sacrifices, so the Israelites sought the true worship of Yahweh. In this way, Moses established another association of Egypt with Cain and of Israel with Abel. A third way Moses created connections with Israel's experience was through the motif of murder. Cain murdered his brother Abel, and the significance of this event becomes evident when we remember the murders of the Israelites that took place in Egypt. In Exodus chapters 1 and 2, we read that the Egyptians not only overworked the Israelites, but actively murdered many of them, including their infant children. In this way, Moses developed still more associations between Cain and the Egyptians, as well as between Abel and the Israelites. A fourth way in which Moses created these associations was by describing Cain's location on the earth. When God cursed Cain for murdering Abel, he banished Cain from the fertile land. As we read in Genesis chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, now you are under a curse and driven from the ground. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. Cain was cursed to live in places where his farming would yield very little produce. This description of Cain's location fit nicely with Moses' assessment of the land of Egypt and of the land where he was taking Israel. Listen to the way Moses contrasted Canaan and Egypt in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 10 through 12. The land you are entering to take over is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you planted your seed and irrigated it by foot as in a vegetable garden. But the land you are crossing the Jordan to take possession of is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. It is a land the Lord your God cares for. God sent Cain to a place far from Eden, to a place like Egypt, where farming required much effort. This fact was another way in which Moses' Israelite readers were to associate Cain with the Egyptians. A fifth way in which Genesis chapters 4 and 5 connected Cain with Egypt and Abel with Israel was in the theme of Cain's protection. Even though Cain killed his brother Abel, God still protected him from harm. We read these words from God in Genesis chapter 4, verse 15. If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over. God protected Cain from harm even though he was a murderer. Once again, we see that Moses described these events so that Israel would associate them with their own experience in Egypt. God had given great protection to Egypt, even though they were murderous and deserved divine judgment. For a long time, God extended special protection to Egypt. So we see that in at least 5 ways, Moses established meaningful parallels between this primeval period and Israel's Exodus experience. The themes of occupations, worship, murder, location, and protection all indicate that Moses wanted his Israelite readers to apply this story to their lives by associating Cain with the Egyptians and by associating Abel with themselves as the people of God.